and welcome to New York City Atheists Live on Tape, brought to you by New York City Atheists Incorporated. I'm your host, Dennis Horvitz, the David Letterman of the Hopelessly Damned. Our guest today is Sean Faircloth, the new Executive Director of the Secular Coalition for America. In June, Mr. Faircloth joined the Secular Coalition, an alliance of 9 atheist organizations, including New York City Atheists, for the purpose of representing secularist groups to Congress. And his mission includes changing public awareness and perception of non-believers, getting atheists to stop being couch potatoes. I'd like to see that happen. And also something he calls the privileging of religion in a way that harms real people. An example would be the George Bush faith-based initiatives that where federal money is funded to these many organizations, including church organizations. And these church organizations are often not subject to the same laws that secular groups dealing with the same needs would have. And prior to this, he was elected representative to the Maine state legislature for 10 years, and in 2006 he was appointed majority whip. So before you run off to 10 your lobster pots, join us for some speech making and hopefully a little down east humor with Sean Faircloth.
Thank you.
I promised him I wasn't going to do it.
Thank you, Dennis, and thank you, Jane. I wanted to thank Ken, all three of you. It's a tremendous turnout for this event, and it really is a tribute to them. You know, Ken was talking about the number of people. I think it was 3 who showed up at one of the first meetings he attended. And look at this meeting. So a round of applause to Ken and Jane. And that he's found that people treat John Lennon's song Imagine almost as an equal to the national anthem of their respective countries around the world. The song was chosen by the people throughout the entire world. Because I think Madison, who was a lawyer, and John Lennon, a poet, both increasingly tried to figure out how human beings interact with each other and how we can make that interaction more noble and more meaningful. That's what the focus of their lives came to be, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. But our efforts in this room have not been enough. We've not been adequate to the task. In the scripture, it does say that God instructs Abraham to kill his child. But we in this room need to remember Amia White and remember her dying alone in that van. We need to remember Jessica Crank with that completely unnecessary death from that horrific tumor. We need to remember these people and speak for them. We cannot sit silently while a modern Abraham is authorized to kill their child. Not in this century, not with our laws, and not under our Constitution. It was the vicious Joe McCarthy era that foisted on us the phrase, one nation under God, when we've always really been one nation under the Constitution. This is our era. This is our century. We need to redouble our efforts. I have tremendous faith in what we can do. When I say I'm devoting my life to this cause, it is because I believe that we are at a turning point in American history, and that if each and every one of you say that you will commit yourselves to this effort, and to make this organization grow in New York and throughout the entire United States, that within the next 10 to 20 years, you will see the true restoration of our constitutional heritage of separation of church and state and of one nation under the Constitution. It is a great future. It is an optimistic future. And I thank you because you are the leaders of that. Thank you so much for hearing me.
Thank you very much. We're going to take some questions. Please make them short and minimize your own political orations.
Sure, okay. She's asking who to look for in terms of national leadership or elective office leadership on the issue of, I think, acceptance of non-theistic Americans and separation of church and state. As for the first half of that, and the mission of our organization, by the way, and our mission statement is increasing the acceptance of non-theistic Americans and fighting for the separation of church and state on your behalf in Washington, D.C. But, of course, we have to mention Member of Congress Pete Stark, who is the only member of Congress who is openly a non-theistic American in the entire 535 members. However, there are many members of Congress who have stood up on behalf of separation of church and state. I don't think I'd want to limit it to one. I mean, Representative Nadler from here in New York has been a strong church and state separationist. I actually had an opportunity to speak with him in June, and it was more of a casual conversation. But I think, for example, that issue that I described in Boulder, Colorado, which can threaten other parts of the country, it's a federal law. Unfortunately, a lot of parts of the country haven't passed comprehensive land use planning, so only in those places would the example I gave be pertinent. But I think he could use some education on those issues, because I think there were Democrats at that time who supported that law that I referenced, because they were thinking of, well, some member of an Indian tribe wants to smoke, or what do you do, smoke or take peyote, whatever it is, and that was part of their religious ceremony. I thought, well, it's a very limited tip of the hat to this person's religious beliefs, but the statute wasn't written that way and allowed for huge exemptions that I don't think they envisioned. And I think we need to work with members of Congress to provide them information about the concerns that have sprung up since that time. But he is someone who, on many people who have that view. But I think it's up to us, as was mentioned by Ken earlier and others, to be very public in terms of, you're a non-theistic American, you're there to speak. I served 10 years in the Maine legislature, and this is why I think it's your job, in a sense. I served 10 years in the Maine legislature. I served 6 years, 3 terms, on the Judiciary Committee, which had the jurisdiction over a woman's right to choose. It had jurisdiction over discrimination based on sexual orientation. So I heard regularly during those 6 years from people who were from the Christian right. I never once, not one time, heard from someone who said, listen, I'm a non-believing American, or I'm a member of American Atheists, or I'm a member of American Humanists, not a single time. And then, I was, in a situation where I was on Appropriations Committee, a so-called promotion, if you will, where they handle the money for the state legislature and for the state government. And I was never contacted then. I was elected by my own colleagues. I was one of 6 members of the leadership of my legislature in my party. Again, never contacted by any non-theistic American for any cause, organization whatsoever. We have to change that. We have to be out there being vocal. In a sense, you can't blame members of Congress when you've got millions of hard-working, and you got to give them credit, hard-working, tithing Christian rightists out there beating their heads, and then they hear silence a lot of times on the other side. It's up to us to make sure that we are heard, and for people to see us and say, we're the folks who, help our kids and grandkids and care about our community. We just happen to believe in a naturalistic worldview, and we happen to believe in keeping church and state separate. So in large measure, it's up to us. There's a lot of good members of Congress who support us on these issues. But I think really the biggest challenge, the fault is not in our stars, but in ourselves. We really need to be the ones who are making that change.
Yeah, go ahead.
On the point that we just mentioned, how do non-theistic people organize themselves in order to have that kind of voice? Because
Right.
In the religious world, it's built in within the system.
Well, we at Secular Coalition are working on that. And first, because I don't want to forget, remember, I don't want to cry. So everybody's going to www.secular.org, signing up for an action alert. But you can go to our website. You can know from our website about federal action alerts that come up. We'll send you an email when something comes up with members of Congress about issues where you can speak out. Sometimes we have template letters so you can take action. So that's an immediate step. And you should not only sign up yourself, but get friends to sign up so they know about what's going on. But there's more that we need to do. In fact, I've just put a plan together for 2010 for our organization. I'm a new executive director, and I have a strong vision for what I think we need to do in the future, because Secular Coalition is about our secular movement in Washington, D.C., lobbying, straight lobbying, but then it's also about coalition. We have 10 member organizations, from American Humanists to Ethical Culturalists to Humanistic Judaism to atheist organizations. And there have been rumors in the past about where sometimes folks from these groups didn't get along. But that's all in the bad old days. That's in the bad old days. Now we're moving on, and we're moving on to a greater unity. So one of the most important things you can do is help Ken Bronstein give to his organization, give to this organization, make sure it's thriving at a local level. Do everything you can to help here at this level. But also, I think we need to, and I think Secular Coalition needs to help take leadership in this, is to organize grassroots training. I used to teach at University of Maine courses about University of Maine system and University of College Bangor about grassroots advocacy and issues like that. And I want to bring some of that where when we go out and travel, we have a sort of a kit that talks to folks about how you can speak out, in this case to Albany, or if you're in Washington State to Olympia, wherever you are. What I'd like to see is sort of a 50-state strategy where I don't think it'll happen next year or next year after that, but in 2010 I want to begin where we can say that in coming years there are organized, active secularists in Washington State, in Maine, but also in Alabama. And I really think it's important to us also to look nationally, even if you live in New York, to say we want to help in the South. We want to help down south and make sure that there's secular values represented there, which is why also you should be involved in national organizations. I'm hoping to put together a leadership training where we go out around the country, but also later invite people to Washington to learn about how to advocate on secular issues. In our brochure, which some of you have, one of the heroes that we list off on our pages is Sherwin Wine, who is the founder with Humanistic Judaism, and I think he did something really great for America by providing that outlet for people of Jewish heritage who want to have a place, a locus for their worldview. So I agree with that. I've had some excellent conversations. I was out in California not too long ago talking to some folks who were ex-Mormons. And it's different hearing it from them. I mean, because they describe some of the things that we only have the vaguest idea about that are within that theology, some scary things. And here's someone who's very knowledgeable. In one case, I talked to a guy who was a former, he would go on missions on behalf of the church, and he can describe some of the activities in which they are engaged. And so I think you're right, that having that kind of fellowship among people who are formally of a background is a very valuable thing. And in fact, if anybody has any ideas, I mean, with Secular Coalition, we have a criteria for membership. And essentially, it's a nonprofit entity with a non-theistic worldview of a national range. So Humanistic Judaism is one of those. Military atheists is another. But I've often thought it'd be great if we saw in the future, perhaps like an ex-Mormon organization, or maybe a non-theistic Catholicism organization, or leaving that, maybe folks who are libertarian worldview. I meet a lot of younger people, interestingly, who are, I was a Democrat in my legislature, but we're a nonpartisan organization. I'll meet these younger people who are of libertarian political philosophy, but they're very non-theistic. And I say we got to have a big tent. We got to welcome these folks in and maybe have an organization for them that then joins the coalition. So I think that's a great idea. I think there's so many Americans that are looking for that place. The data shows, and I think it's very conservative data, that there's 13 to 15% of Americans who are non-theistic in their worldview. I can almost guarantee you that that number is low. In Maine, we don't do it like New York. I mean, in Maine, I knocked on Stephen King's door and I knocked on the poorest person in town's door. I mean, you're like a census taker, the mail carrier. I visit everybody. And so you saw things sociologically, and for that many years, so comparing the 90s to the present, I saw the decrease in people who were going to synagogue, going to Catholic church. It's just gone down. And these are all great, good people who are taking their kids to soccer and doing all the normal things they do in their community, but a lot less church going. And I think those folks, if you really ask the polling questions correctly, you'd find that it's way more than 15% of Americans that have our worldview, but we have to give them a home. And I think some of the issues I talked about, like with the harm to children, for example, that I began my remarks with, that some folks may not get energized because it says, "In God We Trust" on the Capitol Visitors Center. Some do, but some don't care that much. But I know there's a lot of, not to oversimplify, but there's a lot of soccer moms and Joe Sixpacks out there who will say, "Darn it, that's awful. I don't want any kids being treated that way, and I'm with you. And I don't like those fundamentalist preachers anyway, and I'm with you." And they just want that hook to get them there. So I think you have a great suggestion, and we're actually trying to work to help with that. There are three parts to my job. One is the straight lobbying. Second is a sort of administrative or looking at a larger vision. And third is kind of events like this where you go and have outreach to the public. And obviously they have an interconnection. To answer your lobbying question, we had hundreds of lobbying contacts. Some are your typical visit at the office. with someone who's a staff person related to whatever issue. We have, if you go to our website, numerous issues. Some of them I mentioned in my remarks, like the faith-based initiatives, the so-called conscience clause, which is one of the most Orwellian terms ever created. That means where, if this is a true story, a woman was raped in Tucson, she wants to get the morning after pill, the pharmacist says, I'm a fundamentalist Christian, and even though you have a legitimate prescription from a doctor, I'm going to deny you filling that prescription. That's the so-called conscience clause. So we lobby against that sort of thing. There's a whole range of position papers we have taken. I want to do a couple things. You mentioned about 5 years. I put together just the other day, and this is getting a little inside baseball, but a budget for the next 3 years. And in that vision, we talk about initiating a lot of these coalition efforts that I was talking about earlier, which is a big part of our mission. I want to get a more unified voice, not to tell anybody what to do, but to say, let's say, for example, with American humanists and American atheists and humanistic Judaism, they all have different perspectives, different views, and we're not going to force them to change them. We couldn't if we wanted to. But what we do think might be valuable is to say, let's have more joint strategizing. Let's work together on ways of speaking out on non-theistic issues. And secular coalition is the umbrella, I think, that can be very helpful with that. I want to get more people active in the boards of the various organizations that are 10 members. I want to get more people who say, I'm informed about public policy issues, a few of which I described today, and I'm ready, willing, and able to go talk to my member of Congress, but also to my state legislator, where a lot of the policy action is in the United States. And so that's the budget I'm proposing. It's something that I think is important for the future of our movement, is that we come together in terms of having a grassroots kind of educational effort that matches the lobbying mission that we currently have. And right now we have some of that, but we don't have enough of it, and I think Secular Coalition will play an important and I hope lead role. I think it's the right organization to provide a lead role for that purpose. Anytime we could talk to you about meeting with someone locally while they're here in the home district. Then we'll have lobby days occasionally where people come to DC and we bring people with us on visits on Capitol Hill, talking with members of Congress. And we've done that a couple times, and we'll be continuing to do that in the future. We're going to expand upon that. We want to have that an internship program where we have young people involved in the offices of members of Congress, people who would be leaders in the future, who get experience on Capitol Hill, but come from a non-theistic perspective and get training and help from the Secular Coalition for America. So there's a lot more that we want to do on these issues, and we've had tremendous success so far, but a lot more to do. Where we focus more specifically on public policy and public policy change in the United States. One reason is that that's our mission, is primarily lobbying and changing public policy. We're not a philosophical organization per se. But another reason I think is strategic for our entire movement. And that's what I've found is that if you want to get people energized to take action, to get up off the couch, that some of those issues I've talked about, like the faith healing and the child care, where these children are left in neglect situations, that people get energized by the just moral outrage of what they see happening out there with the violation of separation of church and state. And so that public policy can actually be a unifying and activist force. And so that's another reason. I think for decades, let's face it, there's been a lot of concern about there must be millions of Americans who have our worldview, but only a much smaller percentage, a smaller band of people who are actually members of organizations active in some way. I feel that making and bringing to the fore secular policy issues and publicizing them more can have a tremendous positive effect on membership for all of our state, local, regional, and national groups. And so that's part of our plan at Secular Coalition. Americans United for Separation of Church and State is a long-standing organization since the late 1940s. And we pretty much agree with them on the vast majority of issues, and they are a group that's sort of neutral on the question of their own belief. That is to say, there are people who are non-believers who are part of Americans United, and people who are believers who are members of Americans United, and we work hand in hand with them on a regular basis. Similarly, there's the Interfaith Alliance, another expressly religious entity, but takes a strong church-state separation view. Secular Coalition for America is unique in its twofold mission. We are the only organization that represents, first, a coalition. We have all these groups working together as a team, which is unprecedented. And then we certainly argue for separation of church and state, and that's our bread and butter day-to-day work often. But then we also argue for the greater acceptance of non-theistic Americans. And that means that we have a little bit more of an emphasis and a little bit more of a point on some key issues. I mean, we're willing to get out there, for example, on the Boy Scouts issue. We, for example, agree very strongly with the goals of the Human Rights Campaign for gay citizens, but they have not been as pointed with regard to discrimination in the Boy Scouts. The Boy Scouts sometimes get federal funds, sometimes use federal lands for free and other government lands for free. We think that's wrong. They discriminate based on sexual orientation, and they discriminate based on non-theism in that organization. We are uniquely vocal on that issue because others have sort of stood back. And frankly, some of these issues that I described today, there are organizations that agree with us on the horror of faith healing, so-called, and the child care exemptions, but they haven't made it an emphasis. And I think part of our job is, one, because it's the right thing to do to emphasize these issues, but it's also strategic. That I think it allows us a unique position to speak in the public debate that lets people know what's happening, who a lot of Americans don't even know what's happening, but also people read about it in the paper and they go, that's awful, and maybe they join New York City Atheists, maybe they join some other organization because it's the first they've heard of these problems. One word that I want to reclaim is moral, and not just in terms of necessarily non-theistic Americans, but just in terms of our civic discussion. When I was a very little boy, there were people, and they were religious, who were walking on the earth, named Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King, the senator from this state, and Martin Luther King. These are people who I think 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years from now, people will remember them, and remember them because they used the term moral in a way that was meaningful and valuable. The word moral, in my view, has been stolen to pertain almost exclusively to what you do with your naughty bits. And I feel that's an incredible trivialization. Your naughty bits. You know, right.
Naughty bits.
Yes, exactly.
Some it's parts, some it's bits, you know.
Yeah. Whichever. It depends on your own personal taste. But that, for me, that is it's a trivialization of our, in fact, it's a trivialization of our humanity. That if that's what our morality has to do with is somebody inspecting the details of your genital activity, then we've gone terribly wrong. But yet usually, almost always, when I hear the word moral used in public discussion, it has something to do with that. You know, yeah, to me, the issue was that maybe you shouldn't be deceiving somebody, but that sexuality is minor league in terms of issues. If you're someone who uses a corporate power in society to rape the land, destroy the lives of other human beings, well, you'll be welcomed at every big fundraiser in the United States, and everybody will open their arms to you. But we'll get ourselves all exercised about genital morality and spend months and months in tabloids discussing it. And I feel it's a degradation of who we are as human beings, that what happens with poverty and injustice. Well, Secular Coalition for America does not have a position on campaign finance reform. I have my own opinion. In the state of Maine, we have publicly financed campaigns, as is the state of Arizona, so you don't have all this crazy fundraising like you would have in most state legislative races. And of course, we're a long way right now from getting that in the federal level. So I have my personal opinions about it, but to answer your question, no. The Secular Coalition for America and its board have taken the position that they want to meet their mission, that is, of raising the acceptance of non-theistic Americans or separating church and state. And so when we take positions, I'm authorized as executive director. If I can feel quickly that meets that criteria, we can go ahead and lobby on it. If it's a close call, then perhaps not. And we've had a couple of internal debates about, is this enough of a church-state issue? to take a position on it. So in that instance, though, I know my own opinion sounds like it might be similar to yours, but that would not necessarily, unless there was a theologically, unless we saw some...
New York City, is there anything in the agenda?
Well, first, I want to say for Secular Coalition for America, and if this is the last question, that would be Secular Coalition, secular.org, for those who are signing up for it. But, you're right. But to answer your question, Secular Coalition for America, right now, our primary function, in addition to building the coalition, is lobbying the federal government. That's what we do. Now, it is my hope and plan that we would help with grassroots organizing, training, and efforts so that we would, that 50-state vision that I talk about would occur, where eventually you'd have people lobbying at the state and local level. But I would say that that's why I think it's so important to support New York City Atheists and others, so that when you're getting down to the 5 boroughs, that you folks do that. We would help, we would facilitate, but it wouldn't be that we would, go to City Hall in New York City and lobby directly on those kinds of issues. But we would want to help and support New York City Atheists do so.